everybody. Videos are awkward, but I thought I'd send one in because Stacy guilted me into it. Because apparently Justin is sending one in, and he's setting the bar real high. So I thought I'll send one too if Justin's doing it. And I remember this time from last year very vividly. From anyone who's applying for internship right now, I know I pretty much felt like I would take whatever help I could get. And so if a video will be helpful with that, I want to make that easier for you. So I'm sending in this video to just talk about my experiences with interviews. Between phase 1 and phase 2, I had several. I think I had close to 20. And so in Skype and in person. And so just some things that I gathered from that. I know Stacy had asked us to talk about common questions that we got often, as well as interesting questions we received. And I know we all talked a little bit about that last year after interview season ended. We talked about it in small group soup. But the other things that I wanted to name for you are just some potentially good questions that you can ask the site and ask the people who are interviewing you, the faculty of that program, because you are an interviewer as well and you're looking for a fit. And so there are just some things that I kind of observed throughout the process that I really wanted to make sure I got quality information about these things. So I thought I would talk a little bit about some questions to make sure that you're asking the sites and questions that you're asking the current interns. From being on the other side and being in an internship site that is really supportive and functions really well, I just wanted to give some thoughts about how you can get some of that information and really assess if a site's going to give you that experience or if it's going to be more of a kind of workhorse trying to produce, get you to produce a lot of work, but not necessarily invested in training you. So that's something that this interview process really gives you an opportunity to kind of tease out, and so I have some thoughts on that. But I'll start with just common questions that I got related to assessment as well as intervention. They usually would have me describe a case and my approach to it was, so what measures I might have used if it was an assessment, kind of the pertinent information that helped me conceptualize an intervention case, and then basically what I did. And a typical follow-up question would be, well, what would you have changed? So that is something to think about. For assessment, I was also asked what's a gold standard assessment for X common condition. So what's a gold standard assessment for ADHD? What's a gold standard assessment for autism? And in those questions, I think they were really looking for you to name both the components of what the assessment would be to make it a comprehensive evaluation, and then also kind of your command for selecting measures, like what specific measures you would be wanting to use to conduct that assessment. And then the other thing that I got just related to a writing sample that the site had asked for, they had asked for us to submit an assessment report. And then in the interview, they asked about kind of my rationale for how I interpreted data that I had collected through that assessment. And that ultimately led to me deciding whether there was presence of a learning disability or not in this specific instance. But basically just being able to speak to your rationale. There might be, contradictory information just in your report, or, we try to be as thorough as we can, but just maybe something that you haven't been explicit enough about, then a site would maybe follow up on that and ask you about that. So just be prepared for that. Let's see. In terms of interesting questions, kind of those like get to know you questions that we kind of hear and we're like, oh yeah, like I would totally be able to answer that. But I got some of them, and in the moment I was like, whoa, I don't know. So one of those questions was, who would you want to have dinner with, dead or alive? And I kind of was like going through my brain really quickly in that moment, and I had just finished reading Michelle Obama's book, so I said Michelle Obama. which I still stand by, but you want to be kind of thoughtful about your answer and be able to give a reason why, because that's one of those questions they're asking just to get to know you. Similar to that, what would you want to be or want to do for a career outside of the field of psychology? What would you be doing if you were not in this field? I got that question in individual interviews as well as in group interviews, and people really used that as a way to highlight just what they do outside of being a grad student, what they care about. So whether that's baking or reading or hiking, people really use that to kind of set themselves apart as a real person, not as a 100% of the time graduate student, but as a person who values balance and really embodies that. Questions for your site, things you want to be able to ask the people who are interviewing you. One good thing to ask about is postdoc opportunities. You always want to find out if the site is a good fit and you'd want to stay there. Are there options for that? Or if there aren't, just kind of what they do to help you get to that next step for after internship, how they support that. And that's something you can ask in your interviews, but also ask the current interns. Ask them, what do you want to do next? Are you being well prepared to do that? Are you getting support in making the connections you need to be able to kind of move on to your postdoc experience? So another thing that just kind of broadly, ask about specifics for things that are important to you. So for me, one thing was an emphasis on diversity and multicultural practice, and a lot of sites would pay lip service to that in their mission statement and then not really have anything actionable speaking to it in their objectives. And so, just ask for, what does that look like? What are kind of the structures that are in place to make sure that's part of the experience? And related to that, again, you're kind of trying to feel out, is this like a build your own experience where there aren't really core experiences they're trying to make sure interns have? Or are there things that they've thought about, that the site has thought about, that they want to make sure that by the time you leave internship, you've had that experience? And how do they make that happen? So like at my current site, they want to make sure that we are leaving with experience in school crisis response and in conducting our own threat assessments with students. And so we've got kind of a deadline where if that hasn't come up organically at one of our schools, they'll actually talk with the other supervisors about, okay, the next time it comes up at any of our schools, let's call Liz or let's call one of the interns because they haven't had that experience yet. So things like that, you just want to find out what are their core training experiences that they're making sure you have, and how are they going to make sure that you get those experiences. And then kind of questions for the current interns, you always want to feel out their satisfaction and their work-life balance, and just kind of figuring out if they're happy. And if they aren't, able to really speak to that specifically, or they'll be like, yeah, it's going good, but then they kind of drop off, or you get kind of a weird vibe from it, follow up on that, and that's really important information. In line with that, you want to ask about if there were any surprises that current interns experienced once they got to the site, got into the internship experience. Was anything different from what they expected? This was actually a question that we got at my site from our accreditation site interviewers. We had our site interview just a couple weeks ago, and they just asked, were there any surprises? Was everything as they told you that it would be? And here, that was the case, but sometimes that's not the case. So that's something you want to ask about too. So related to that, like what did orientation look like? Ask interns what the orientation period looked like. Did they feel prepared? Just hearing from the other interns in my cohort and people they know who are on internship, sometimes there isn't really much of an orientation period, and you're starting week one with this huge caseload, and you're still trying to learn the systems that are going on at the site and just kind of trying to get acclimated. And that feels very different than a site that takes, several days to kind of walk you through here's how this system works here, and kind of review things that you probably have learned in grad school, but review them in the context of your specific site, and kind of scaffold you getting started with cases. So that's something to consider. And then I think just for current interns as well, you want to ask them, do they have the tools they need to do their work? So do they have access to the measures they need, to the therapy rooms, to the workspace? And, I think no site's going to be perfect on those things, but at least try to feel out, do they have someone available to them to kind of help navigate when there's issues with that stuff, and just kind of trying to be able to solve that. So are they kind of on their own and they're floundering a little bit, and all these things are just kind of different indicators of how stable a site is, which I think is really important when you think about it being a training experience, not just a work experience. So those are my thoughts. I hope this is helpful. You're welcome to email me if you have more questions. I know this period of time is hard if you've just applied and now you're waiting to hear back about interviews. So I think directing your energy towards just kind of reviewing these questions, making sure you're feeling really good and crisp on your responses to them. That's a good distraction technique, and it's also helpful. It'll be helpful for you when those interviews do start coming in. So, all right, well, I will talk to you all later. Good luck.